So it's a real delight to welcome you, Mark, to the Multispecies Reading Group. You've shared the pandemic century with us, and in particular, this lovely chapter on parrot fever. And this book explores a lot of things that are incredibly timely. I mean, you had a lot of foresight to anticipate a lot of the realities that we're living through right now. You talk about the permanent states of anxiety in this era before the pandemic, when there was sort of constant warnings of sort of scenarios to come. You also kind of go into sort of some of the much earlier writings about folks who were sort of skeptical of short-term techno fixes. In 1959, you engage with this Rockefeller researcher, René Dubois, who argued against someone who was sort of integral in developing, I guess, the first effective antibiotic therapies. Yep. Warning against, like, okay, these aren't magical solutions to these super complicated problems. So maybe before we get into the details of parrot fever, maybe you could talk about some of the broad themes of the book. You're drawing on sociological and philosophical insights to think about the construction of scientific knowledge, and we see this play out in parrot fever with these uncertain epistemologies surrounding this emergent disease. But you're also situating your analysis of disease emergence in the context of the disturbance of ecological equilibriums and alternations to the environment in which pathogens reside. So maybe if you could just start out by kind of talking about the parts of the book that we didn't read and your broad analysis.
Wow. So look, thank you first of all, very kind introduction. I suppose what I quite like about interdisciplinary groups like this is it gives me a chance to see how readers and informed readers, which you're much more informed than a lot of the groups I address, what you see in the book. Yeah, I mean, you're quite right. There are lots of different intersecting themes, and it's been quite interesting to me to think about some of these themes in the light of the experience of COVID-19, which I'm sure we're going to come to. So I suppose the primary theme is the theme of the epistemology of scientific knowledge and the role of medical expertise, really. So a lot of the book is kind of looking at the sources of medical expertise and the way that has ever since the dawn of bacteriology, really. There has been this sort of kind of triumphant mode of medical research, which is we are discovering how pathogens learning how to control infectious disease. And what is interesting is if you systematically go back through each of the major epidemic outbreaks of the last 100 years or more, which is the theme of the book, it was just striking to me how each time medical expertise was kind of hoisted by its own petard, right? Sometimes a little knowledge was more dangerous than no knowledge at all, if I could put it that way. So really, I became very interested in exploring both these epistemological blind spots, but also the way that knowledge itself could mislead or misdirect responses to epidemics, or engender a sense of complacency. So a lot of my story focuses on the pathogens themselves, but of course this all takes place within a wider context of preventive medicine and public health responses. So you quite rightly point out that René Dubois is one of the sort of, I suppose, if I can put it this way, one of the heroes in a way, someone who sort of foresaw the dangers of overconfidence for medical research, so specifically in relation to antibiotics. But then he widened his scope considerably, and became as much a sort of historian himself, medical historian himself, as a medical researcher. But I was particularly interested in this period in the interwar period, 1920s, 1930s, when unusual outbreaks such as psittacosis and other diseases were occurring. And this was the point when there was still a tension between the sort of one germ, the germ theory model of disease, and the ecological context in which researchers also understood disease at that time. So a lot of the research, a lot of this book came out of research I was doing as a Wellcome Research Fellow into the history of disease ecology and recovering these insights that have been subsumed within bacteriology and then virology. And there are particular figures who are particularly important. You've mentioned Dubos, but an earlier figure or contemporaneous with Dubos was Carl Friedrich Meyer, who was a sort of at that point in the history of medical research. He was not only a pathologist and a laboratory technician, but a field epidemiologist. So he was able to encompass all the different aspects that have now been splintered and separated into different silos. And of course, Dubos, I probably should have sent you another paper, not the one I sent you on Ebola, but one from the Journal of the History of Biology, where Dubos corresponded very closely with Macfarlane Burnet, who of course is seen as the person who first puts the ecological ideas about disease on the medical map. But he was corresponding with Meyer and other researchers, and Burnet was particularly interested actually in the outbreak of psittacosis, because there was one in Melbourne, I think, in the 1930s that led to his interest in his correspondence with Meyer over this. So there were these researchers who were in different institutions, research institutions, and those researchers were all focused on, identifying, the germ or, the pathogen that was and sort of trying to devise medical countermeasures. But of course, a lot of researchers were becoming more and more aware of the role that ecology and social context and also the built environment played in these outbreaks. So I suppose part of the idea of the book was to recover those perspectives and sort of ask the question, why are we always focused on these vertical top-down interventions at the expense of these ecological lessons and tried and tested public health measures that have been used for, well, centuries?
Thank you. That was really enlightening. So Meyer, who you were just mentioning, comes in at the end of the Parrot Fever chapter. He kind of gets the last word, talking about the ways that rapid economic and industrial change was disrupting the balance between humans and microbes. And towards the beginning of that chapter, I really like on page 72, how you're introducing the disease, not only in terms of the misplaced concreteness on parrots, you're talking about the canaries, finches, pigeons, doves, kestrels, not to mention the industrially produced poultry that can harbor the intracellular parasite, but also about how the conditions of stress, such as when food becomes scarce or birds are packed into small crates, that's actually what
right.
kind of
Yeah,
produces
so exactly. So right. So a major theme of the book is not just the way that. So I mean, it's quite interesting because I haven't read the Parrot Fever chapter for some time, but when I'm rereading, I'm realizing the light of COVID. I mean, the parrots are asymptomatic carriers, right? They at the time they were known as like latently infected or hidden carriers of disease. But essentially, I mean, we created this problem with our technology with the bird trade, because as long as birds were in their natural environment in the Amazon, they would be taken from the Amazon and sold in pet shops in Buenos Aires and other parts of South America. But the real problem was when they were packed into crates, which both created the ideal sort of ecological conditions for the transfer of a latent infection to non-infected birds, But also, of course, you're right. I mean, Meyer's studies were all about the role that crowding the parakeets into crates and transporting them, via ship and then across state lines, how that actually created the conditions for, the spillover of the infections and sort of outbreaks of disease. So I think that, this is an insight that comes up time and time again on the chapter on Legionnaire's disease. Legionnaire's is, after all, if we hadn't built hotels and hospitals with uh, water cooling towers, creating the ideal environment for an amoeba to thrive, on the surface of water, we wouldn't have had, we probably would never have noticed Legionnaires as a cause of atypical pneumonias. So this theme comes up time and time again, but you're right. The story of the role that commerce really plays, the commerce, in this case being the commerce of the bird trade, is absolutely fascinating. And a lot of why Meyer is also an interesting figure is, he was very much focused on public health, right? Alongside his laboratory studies and investigations into disease at the Hooper Foundation in San Francisco, he worked very hard to set up a school of public health at University of California. And he got it going, and his idea was to bring together all the different disciplines and sort of, try and transfer these insights into public health. And he also, actually worked very closely with Californian officials to regulate the bird trade and persuade, because it was like, the thing to understand is at this time, it was almost like a backyard, coming out of the Great Depression all over Southern California. To earn extra money, people basically set up these aviaries in their backyard. So it was like a sort of cottage industry. It wasn't like this massive wide-scale industry. It was lots of micro, bird breeders. And not keeping the birds in ideal conditions and not really being aware of the infections they might harbor. So progressively, as the sort of the identity of the pathogen, it became known what the cause was, then it became possible to regulate this industry and do all the things we do now, such as introduce antibiotics into the bird feed. But that was a process that met a lot of resistance, right? There was a lot of skepticism. I don't know if you want me to continue talking about this, but I was also struck rereading this chapter, how at this point in the history of public health or global health, we didn't have these sophisticated surveillance systems, right? We didn't have ProMed scanning, the ether for chatter about unusual disease outbreaks. A lot of the book has got looks at the role that medical research plays and gaps in medical knowledge and the uncertainty that surround epidemic outbreaks, how that feeds into press hysteria, right, and panic. But actually, the story about psittacosis is almost the reverse. It was the Hearst newspaper group who alerted, medical researchers to the problem, right? Because they picked up on the story and thought this is a sensational story. So they sensationalized it. And then it was latterly realized when there were these outbreaks of Baltimore that, could this be the same thing that the yellow press was sensationalizing a few weeks earlier? Kind of ironic.
And this might be sort of unfair to ask of you because I've written things a while ago myself and don't exactly remember what I said.
Yeah.
But I was wondering if you could just walk us through the epistemological uncertainty that surrounded the emergence of this. So at various points, people were convinced it was a virus. At other point, it seemed to be passing through filters, and then and I think it's also maybe an opportunity to revisit kind of the history of virology at that particular moment, or microbiology. Today it's easy to sequence a genome or look at something with an electron microscope. But what kinds of devices were mobilized to this question of what is this, and ultimately how did a stable matter of fact get settled?
Well, I mean, essentially at this time, so previous to the outbreak of psittacosis in 1930, there had been previous isolated outbreaks which were connected to imported parakeets. So those outbreaks occurred in Switzerland, in Zurich and Paris. Um, uh, and the first person to really investigate this was a disciple of Pasteur called Nocard. And from what I recall, what happened was that there had been an outbreak in Paris that was connected to an importation of diseased birds from Buenos Aires. Um, the birds all died, but Nocard got hold of the bird, the corpse of the bird and their wings, and basically he isolated what he thought was the pathogen from the diseased bird's wings, and then experimented. So there was no possibility of really studying a virus. I mean, the breakthrough in virology doesn't come till 1933, when, at the National Institute of Medical Health in Hampstead in North London, um, they isolate the influenza virus and cultivate it in chicken egg embryos. So prior to that point, all we really have are animal passage experiments, and these porcelain filters called Chamberlain filters, which basically are used to filter out uh, so basically you filter out the presumptive, all the bacteria which can't pass through the filter, and then in the filtrate, what you're left with is anything that's small enough to pass through that filter. So that's where you get the presumption of, okay, this might be a filter passing virus that's present in this disease material. But what Nakar did essentially is he, injected the filtrate into all sorts of different animals, from other birds to mice and guinea pigs, and reproduced a disease that he thought was psittacosis. The problem was that he had got the wrong pathogen. So this is a story that happens time and time again. It happened in the 1890s, when another disciple, disciple Robert Koch, Pfeiffer, thought that he had isolated the bacillus of influenza. So this was one of those classic wrong turns, where a little knowledge doesn't actually demonstrate what you think it demonstrates. In the case of psittacosis, so the problem was, it's an atypical pneumonia. So much like COVID today, it was misidentified with lots of other diseases, including flu and typhoid. So a lot of medical research and doctors at the time initially thought, oh, this looks like typhoid. They thought it must be a foodborne illness. And it took quite a while for people to make the connection with birds. It was only really because, based on the case epidemiology, there was nearly all the typical patient, the typical victim, were elderly ladies or widowers who, gathered together for a coffee clatch. And typically there would be a pet parrot or parakeet in a cage in the same room. And what would happen is the birds would, flutter their wings and spread their desiccated fecal matter, as a fine aerosol throughout the room. Once scientists made this connection, of course, it became important to prove that causally. And this is really where the precursor of the National Institutes of Health, which was then in a different building in Washington, D.C., came in. So they basically, as you know, a lot of the book, a lot of that chapter is taken up with the story of how Armstrong and other people at the hygienic laboratory, as it was called, basically conducted these passage experiments, equivalent today, I suppose, of a BSL, biosafety level 3 or 4. But of course, they were nothing like that. I mean, these were very rudimentary controls. Long story short, everyone in the building practically got infected. Several medical researchers died. And as you'll know, if you read the chapter, they ended up fumigating the whole building and, killing every animal that had been used in the experiments, because they became so fearful that they created a kind of biological hazard in the heart of Washington, D.C. perhaps in retrospect could have made more of that, because that comes into the Ebola chapter very strongly. You can trace the whole kind of panic and focus around Ebola back to an outbreak that occurred in DC in 1989, when they were experimenting with apes, chimps infected with Ebola. So it's quite interesting reconstructing these stories, and a lot of the same themes come up. There's at that time, of course, in the 1930s, science writers like Paul de Cruyff are very much writing. It's like the acme of bacteriology. People like Karl Mayer, they were on the cover of Reader's Digest, right? This was the time of the medical researcher as disease detective and microbiological hero.
Yeah, super interesting stuff. I love your descriptions of the early PPE here with full body suits, glass goggles, and helmets and rubber gloves. And not only are they doing a full sanitation, this is cyanide. Reports
Yeah.
of birds dropping out of the sky.
Yeah.
And I think what you were just talking about fuels I think a broader discussion about anxiety, and you described the permanent anxiety with the discourse about the next big one, of course writing before the current pandemic, not knowing that a pandemic was coming. I feel like at the same time we were getting these constant warnings before, in the before times, but much in the same way that, like, I think a lot of us got numb to like the terrorist threat alert during the Bush era, right? Which was constantly, it was never quite green. It was either yellow or red, and the next big one was always about to come.
Yeah, but can I just make a point here? Part of the reason I wrote this book was because I thought it was important to remind, so this book has two audiences. I'm very glad that you're reading it. But it was a fine balancing act, because I wanted this to reach a wider audience, and I wanted people who've never studied the history of medicine or the history of science to appreciate the role that scientific knowledge itself plays. So, I mean, before I became a medical historian, I was for many years a journalist. And you hear this time and time again, that it's the fault of the media that we have these recurrent panics and hysterias. And Paul de Cruyff kind of was saying that back in the 1930s. But of course, one of the reasons I wrote this book was to show how this always starts with medical science and research itself. I think the best way I can think of this in contemporary terms is if you go back to 2009, when we had the swine flu outbreak, right? If that outbreak had occurred in the 19th century, or even, the middle decades of the 20th century, nobody would have noticed, right? There would have been no broadcasting about the dangers of a new pandemic virus, because we didn't have this whole discourse about pandemics defined by virological criteria. So it was only because it had become possible by 2009 to type a new type of swine flu virus that was a triple, or I think was a quadruple recombinant virus, that the WHO then triggered this whole triage system, and in particular the contracts for a pandemic flu vaccines. If that had happened in the 19th century, and the Yucatan, where we think this originated, had been one of those blank spaces on the map, it would have just blended into all the usual respiratory outbreaks we get every winter. So I don't think we wouldn't have had the panic. So that's traced back originally to science, but also to the whole system of global surveillance, both epidemiological and virological, that we built on top of that. I just also want to make another quick point. But despite all that, I was also becoming increasingly worried of the way that within my own discipline, primarily medical history, but I also count medical anthropology in this. It had become very fashionable to treat all these global health security discourses as though they were somehow divorced from the biology and were a kind of a self-contained universe that simply legitimated certain forms of intervention and an industry of pandemic preparedness that was creating alarms or unlocking funding for certain groups. And obviously, this was always from the perspective of the global north, looking at pandemic threats that might disrupt our developed, industrialized societies. And, a lot of those critiques seem to question whether or not these were real legitimate fears. I won't quote the titles, but there were books that sort of actually were very skeptical, and the whole approach was extremely relativistic, as though we're no longer taking the biology seriously. So I thought it was very important to remind people that, the ecological lessons really are that, these outbreaks can happen at any time and we contribute to them. But then there is a separate debate to be had as to what is a rational and more, how can I put it, kind of really a fairer response. Where should we be spending fundings? And I think this is where the insights of the biomedical researchers in an earlier period, such as Dubos, come in, because Dubos' whole perspective was, look, don't get bewitched by the way in which we've made all these breakthroughs, and while medical schools are teaching we're on the point of beating or the conquest of infectious disease. He was prepared to take the long view and remind people of the role that we ourselves play and have always played in the emergence, to use the modern terminology, of these infectious disease threats, and that the solutions have always been in our hands. We don't necessarily need all these technologies. We don't need necessarily this whole apparatus of global health security. What if we just invested in tried and tested public health measures and distributed resources more equitably to the regions and locations where these outbreaks occur? So this has been the challenge that we're still confronting today, I think.
And others should feel free to jump in and ask questions. I've got
please jump in. I don't want to talk the whole time.
No, this has been super fascinating. One just sort of thought on kind of the way that dread. Let's see. So you've got a quote in here. Epidemics have an unusual power to provoke panic, hysteria, and dread. And I think, at least for me, part of the dread that I saw early in the SARS-CoV-2 emergent story was kind of the modernist ontologies and cosmologies coming unhinged. I mean, in the history of thought, you do have rare medical scientists who point out, some of the characters that you're engaging with, sort of the limitations of medical science and our capacity to know and intervene. But of course, kind of the overwhelming majority of the medical establishment is or maybe at least the secular, the widespread secular belief in the predictability of scientific progress and mastery. I mean, I sort of saw that coming unhinged early in the pandemic, and I think that is
I mean, I think this really comes back to the theme of medical expertise. So at any one point in the history of medicine and science, there's a particular form of medical expertise which is dominant. So if you go back to 1918, bacteriology was quite new. So of course you had claims by Richard Pfeiffer that he'd identified the supposed bacillus of influenza. But if you look at the response of particularly in Britain, but also in the United States, the medical profession was very relaxed about influenza. and overconfident that preventive medicine, so they were, British medical profession was convinced that preventive medicine was sufficient to control this, and that very simple tried and tested measures such as home isolation, um, gargling with saline water, using a handkerchief to catch coughs and expectorations, that would be sufficient. They never considered the possibility of border closures. They thought that those were appropriate measures for things like cholera or plague, but they basically dismissed any idea that we should take more forceful action, because this wasn't the influenza, right, that we saw every season. This was more like a plague of influenza, if you like. And it's kind of what I find interesting is at that point we didn't really. I mean, epidemiology was probably epidemiology was at least as powerful, probably more powerful than bacteriology. That was the primary science. Started going back to William Farr, and the whole science of Victorian vital statistics. But epidemiologists had only just started really modeling epidemics and pandemics. Fast forward 102 years, and what do we find? We find that epidemiologists are driving our response to COVID-19 using statistical models, right, to model the R, right? We've all become proficient at this language of epidemiology, of flattening the curve and the R. But the problem with that, of course, is those models, again, this is a way that expertise, can both help us but also blind us. So those models were all predicated on influenza, not on a completely new pathogen that we've now learned has lots of very important differences. So the coronavirus has a longer incubation period, right? It's more infectious than influenza, right? All these things mean, I mean, the main mistake that I see happening is at the beginning, of course, you had people who saying, ill-informed people like Donald Trump saying this is a common flu, what not to be worried. But you also had, philosophers, well-known European philosophers, saying the same thing. Why are we going into a lockdown? All this fuss about, a coronavirus. We always get these flu-like respiratory. So, but the point I'm really trying to make, I suppose, is that I think the disease modelers themselves, really, we relied on the science of disease modeling to tell us whether we should, what was going on, right? And we failed to engage in different ways. There are different forms of imaginative engagement with pandemics, right? And this is where I really think medical history comes in, because if you take the long view, I was hyper aware of, for instance, you develop a kind of sense, a kind of sixth sense, like this looks a lot like 1918, but it's not exactly the same as 1918. And I've been interested to read, for instance, that the people at the AstraZeneca, the Oxford Vaccine Group, started working on a coronavirus vaccine in the middle of January, right? So at the same time where we had all these other expert groups saying, well, there's no evidence of human to human transmission. We really don't know if there's asymptomatic spread. They were already thinking, this looks, smells, and tastes like 1918. We need a vaccine. So I think that's another example of where, when we silo and how can I put it? We reify one particular medical science. So at this stage, we've reified disease modeling and obviously virology itself, and forget other lessons around, historical lessons of how people have always coped with epidemics or pandemics through, for instance, social distancing or home isolation or closing borders, so you can get control of an outbreak. We forgot all these things. We forgot all these insights from kind of longue durée approaches to medical history.
Frederic, you have your hand up.
Yeah, well, thank you for your excellent book. Very useful and very pleasing to read. I was interested to see that you included psittacosis in the history of pandemics, because psittacosis, from what I got from the chapter, it was not experienced as a pandemic by the actors or the public health experts. And it was not retrospectively constructed as a pandemic, as, for example, 1919 influenza. So how did you come to integrate psittacosis in your history of pandemics? And so is it what made you think that the number of cases around the world could allow to consider it as a pandemic? And also, how were you influenced by the management of avian influenza in retrospectively considering psittacosis?
Okay, so I have to correct a misapprehension there, Frederick. It was at the time constructed as a pandemic. That's in the primary literature. So I wasn't retrospectively doing this. It was there. I mean, retrospectively, I think you can argue, was it really a true pandemic? But actually, if you look at the current case definition of the World Health Organization, which is essentially it's got to be an outbreak of a novel pathogen to which nobody has immunity. It ticks that box. And it has to be in more than one country, 2 regions at the same time. So it actually ticks all the boxes that we'd use today to define a pandemic. But that was in the literature at the time. I think to a certain extent that nomenclature, if I can put it that way, reflected the way that the press hysteria. So there was very intense reporting of these outbreaks. And, because this was the height of the yellow press, the William Hearst newspaper group in America, and these outbreaks were seen to be occurring, in every major metropolitan area of the States, from Baltimore to New York to Chicago to the West Coast. And then, journalists, the medical researchers actively looked for other cases, which they soon found in Berlin and then in South America. That's all in the literature at the time. But you're right, of course. I mean, very few people died. I mean, I think worldwide there, I can't remember the figures, but there were probably no more than 1,000 documented cases. But a lot of the hysteria, of course, was driven by the fact that, who were the victims? They were elderly ladies or widowers. So it fed very much into this is at a time where American science, again, is becoming overconfident of breakthroughs in bacteriology and thinking, that we have the technology to control these outbreaks. So it very much sort of kind of punctured that sort of hubristic sense that, medical research was on the point of controlling all these scourges of the past, particularly because this was something that, it happened in your own home, right? You weren't safe in your own home. So I think that it very much played into those ideas. Yeah, I mean, thinking about avian flu, it's quite difficult because, of course, by the time we become aware of avian flu, we have the whole ecological story is much more well established, isn't it? And through the work of Lever, I forget the other researcher, we know that wild waterfowl can harbor, I mean, I see the story of avian influenza as really starting very much more from that early research, which is making visible a threat that was previously invisible, right? So I think that the parrot fever was kind of a forgotten episode. And you can now see when you reflect back, there are quite a few parallels with avian influenza. But in terms of medical, I mean, it wasn't written very much about. I have to say, I suppose partly I picked it because it is such a rich narrative story. And it does really sort of drive home both the role that the media play in sort of telegraphing and amplifying emotional responses to these outbreaks. But also, I mean, through my research into Maya's correspondence with Burnett, it was very clear how important this outbreak was to the formation of these ecological perspectives, which later become very, very important to the story of avian influenza. So I really see this as the starting point for, you know, that ecological point of view. So I don't know if there was a follow-up there.
I see Daniel's hand up.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for this excellent book. And thanks for telling us that you were a journalist. I was really wondering how a historian can learn to write so well. I mean, your prologue is just a fantastic introduction into the whole topic. I was really interested.
Can I just say something about that? So I had to unlearn everything I learned as a journalist to become a medical historian. And then I had to relearn it all again.
Yeah.
Anyway, go on.
Yeah, no, I was interested in your remarks about medical expertise, and especially these shifts between epidemiology and bacteriology, and or microbiology, you could perhaps say. And I'm wondering, when do you see the emergence of ecology coming in as a maybe separate field of foundational research that becomes then a field of, or has it become a field of medical research? So can we read also a genealogy of One Health in your story of epidemics somehow? And
so that's a very good question. So you know, I've done a lot of work on this with other people like Warwick Anderson, you know, who obviously kind of started a lot of the interest in this field by going back to this period. To give you the short answer, ecological research, it never became really an established separate field. I mean, until One Health, you know, it never really had a place in medical schools or in schools of public health. It was like an insight, a sort of approach to disease that was always looking for a home. And in different institutions, different parts of the world, you can see how it does briefly become a sort of field of, you know, there are specific times when, you know, so for instance, Meyer works very hard to get these ecological insights incorporated into his teaching at Berkeley, right? But Dubot later on tries to set up a sort of institute of human ecology. But Dubot is particularly fascinating on this because even though he realizes the power of these ecological insights, he's also skeptical as to whether these ecological perspectives, whether you can really define what ecology is, right? And, you know, what's the appropriate term even? He doesn't know, should we call this human ecology? Should we call it human animal ecology? You know, he kind of almost thinks, well, is it really an organizing science, or is it just more of a sort of a metaphor that is useful for making sense or for legitimating certain perspectives? But he, at the same time, he realizes that actually, if you want to get, you know, funding, it's not going to be a sustainable model for medical researchers. And he eventually calls his institute, that's funded by the Rockefeller, environmental. The environmental comes into the title. It's not ecological. So I think this is really the story of these ecological perspectives. It's only, I think, relatively recently that they've been built much more into, you know, global health itself. But the problem is, of course, that interrupting this, and this is really one of the key insights, is that, you know, really, if you go back to people like Alexander Langmuir, right, there's a whole tradition also in medical geography of, particularly through studies of diseases like malaria, the control of malaria, which becomes an important site for, you know, public health through the CDC in the 90s. But that's how the CDC gets set up. And you see these ecological ideas coming into the CDC, but then they very soon become subsumed within the securitization narrative, right? that it's really all about the dangers of biological warfare and containing, you know, that. So you then get these ecological ideas sitting alongside those, and eventually re-emerging within the emerging infectious disease paradigm, right? So that's really where ecology comes back in and tries to be unified with all these other approaches, the epidemiological ones, and, you know, virology. And then I think One Health kind of sits alongside that, right? Sometimes being, you know, sometimes having more influence, but always kind of being, how can I put this, subsidiary really to that dominant EID paradigm. So it's an interesting story. I don't think the history of that sort of, the period of this in the 1950s and 60s has been fully written. But it is apparent how ecology is always looking for a home, and you know, medical researchers who are interested in that kind of really have to reinvent the discipline every time they want to sort of legitimize it.
Can I have a quick follow-up?
Yeah.
Has there been any trade at all between plant pathologists and the agricultural sector, soil pathologies, and
Well,
that
yeah, I mean, so
whole...
René Dubos, so one of the things that I did, not in this book, but in the research leading up to it, was look at how these ecological ideas entered medical microbiology in the first place. And there were lots of different routes. In the case of René Dubos, it was very much came out of his studies of soil science. So he was, you know, he went to an agricultural college in France. He was not a medical microbiologist until he went to Rutgers and studied under Waxman. And, you know, he was a soil scientist, essentially. I'm not quite sure what happened to that subsequently. Again, all these, so there certainly would have been people working in plant, you know, plant-based approaches in farming, but it was all siloed, right? That would be happening in an agricultural college somewhere, but there wouldn't be a dialogue or a connection between someone, say, like Dubos working the Rockefeller or Meyer, who were also interested in these, but from the point of view of, you know, pathogens that could cross from animals to humans. So this is the story that happens time and time again. You know, Warwick Anderson has written a lot about how it became more possible to join up these scientists in settler societies like Australia, where, you know, it was possible to bring together different scientists, and you had, you know, I mean, Charles Elton, you presumably know the story of Charles Elton, animal ecology. You know, that was really the primary influence. Besides soil science, a lot of these ideas came out of studies of animal ecology, which then re-link back into One Health when that gets up and running in the 1980s. But it's interesting. I don't know if Frederick Keck has any point of view on this, but it's not clear to me always how those ideas enter the study of avian influenza. It seems to be almost like a separate story, you know.
Well, the research on avian influenza, as you mentioned, were led by Graham Lever and Robert Shortridge, right. Robert Webster in Australia, in the 1970s.
Yeah.
But they were trained by Burnett, so they were under the influence of the idea of invasive species and Australia as a closed ecosystem.
Right.
Except that included wild birds, not through the illegal wild trade, but rather through migrations. And
But again, I mean, I think the significant thing about that was their research very soon gets subsumed within the emerging infectious disease paradigm, right? It predates it, right? So it's in the, isn't it 1977 that they make those breakthrough with the wild, the shearwaters that they see on the beach. But very soon after, it gets incorporated into the Institute of Medicine's report. I don't know if we should talk about HIV Aids, because this often gets forgotten in this whole story. It struck me how a lot of people now in the wake of COVID-19 are becoming more interested again in, well, what happened during HIV AIDS, which you're probably too young, but that's what I actually lived through and kind of remember. But there are a lot of people, like younger people who don't know that story really. I mean, that's the reason I bring that up is I think HIV/AIDS is the exception to the rule that I try to sort of explore in the book. So, unlike all the other outbreaks that I canvass, you can't say that we were somehow misled by our knowledge. I mean, on the contrary, the reason, it took 2 years to work out that HIV was a retrovirus, but it only became possible to do that because for the first time in medical history, we had the laboratory tools to actually identify a retrovirus. We could not have done that in 1970. But secondly, we had a theoretical framework because of the research that had been done, into cancers, that we could actually theorize that there could be a different type of virus out there. So I found that very interesting because I didn't really know that when I entered the HIV trial. I had to it was not a field I'd sort of dug into in great depth. But in the process of doing that, I began to see, oh, this is actually not like the other pandemics I explore.
Mm. And since you talk about HIV, how do you assess the connections between the research on the origins of HIV among primates in Africa and then the following mobilizations on Ebola as a disease transmitted by primates? So how the origins of HIV allowed scientists to prepare for future outbreak coming from Africa?
Yeah, well, I think it's important because the experience of HIV is really what drove that report by the Institute of Medicine, right? All those insights were coming into it, and people were beginning to worry about animal origin pathogens that could bridge species. So, that's really the heart of that concept, the idea that there could be an epidemiological bridge, these sort of events which can have multiple ecological and sociological causes. So I really think that is the real origin of that paradigm, that we're still kind of very much driving the public health, global health responses today. What else did I want to say on that? But at the same time, I mean, I think what comes into the story with Ebola much more, and this is different to HIV/AIDS, is that we also have these kind of constructions of a biological hazard, that Ebola can be weaponized, that it can be released from a lab, and that's why it's so scary and terrifying, and why we have to throw funds at it, right? Because it becomes a military priority, a political priority.
So we're almost at our witching hour. Rachel, did you have a question? I saw you unmute briefly earlier.
Yeah, thanks, Evan. Thanks, Mark. This was so great. I just was sort of musing on the race and class and gender dimensions of this as I was reading both of the pieces, and just thinking a little bit more about motivations towards care or senses of responsibility, and motivations towards surveillance, and narratives about threat and biothreat. And I was just so struck by the piece on Ebola, and especially that citation that you made around 2014 or 2015, in which you have the missionaries returning to the United States.
Right.
And these kinds of, the sort of, and I remember that moment, and as somebody who was trained in American Studies department, there was a lot of conversation, going on about this, and the racialization of the conversations, and yet, and then in I don't want to say in contrast, but just comparing that then to the Great Parrot Fever narrative that you're piecing together through these archives, and I can't get that image out of my head of the decidedly middle and upper middle class, I imagine largely white ladies sort of being kissy with the birds in the household, and these very different motivations towards scientific, not just scientific knowledge making, but motivations towards care and responsibility. That was something that is just striking to me as I read these different different pieces, and I'm curious.
Yeah, okay. I would say I'm not quite sure, but I suppose when I'm thinking of these stories and the comparison with Ebola, you know, this really goes back to all the way back to Robert Koch and the idea that there are latent carriers, hidden carriers of infection. So we've seen throughout medical histories, beginning with the outbreak in Hamburg in the 1890s, how you know, certain groups who are seen to be carriers of infection who might cross borders can become objects of stigmatization and biopolitical interventions, you know, to control them. So that's what we saw very much with Ebola, right? In the case of parrot fever, it wasn't people but birds. But there was that same sense. I mean, the reason why the emotional responses, which kind of look slightly hysterical now, were so strong, was because it was this deep fear, which is very much, I see this as a particularly American thing. You know, in America, it's always been about, you know, hygiene and sanitizing, you know, domestic, middle class, for want of a better word, spaces, right? And sort of cutting us off from, you know, insulating us from the dangers, the threats in the natural world. And we've saw that played out very much, particularly with Trump's tweets when he was still a property developer, not yet president, talking about, you know, we shouldn't let these health workers back in. He was talking about the white missionaries, right? You know, it's their choice if they go over there to that place in Africa, but they shouldn't be bringing these African diseases back into the American hearth and home. So in the 1930s, that role was played by parakeets from the Amazon. I just want to say something else very, very, very quickly. I think there is a big piece. So I've become very aware as a historian of the need. This is a different point, but it's about race and the role that race and occupation plays in the risk that societies face from epidemic diseases. So a lot of the literature on the 1918 pandemic talks about influenza at the time being this universal democratic killer. One of the interesting things about COVID-19, and this was happening before COVID, but it's reinforces that a lot of researchers have now gone back and re-evaluated their empirical resources and saying, well, actually, you know, this is not the case. There were, you know, the influenza had a much bigger impact on the American South, in Black communities. You know, there's been very good work by Sven Erik Mamelud showing the impact or differential impact of influenza in Stockholm and working class parts of the city. So I think what I find it fascinating about, you know, actually living through a pandemic experience is that it forces you to re-engage and re-examine a lot of things that I think I accepted in the literature without, you know, maybe enough critical reflection.
Yeah, and actually on that note, we had a piece early in the pandemic that Lakshmi Krishnan and Michelle Ongwale shared on racial disparities in the 1918 pandemic, and looked at how segregation in effect was a cordon sanitaire, but also was a deep dive into the speculation about biological difference between African Americans and white Americans. But
that's important. Yeah, I mean, a lot of that comes out of the medical literature, because you know, a lot of the source material that you rely on are reports written by the then medical authorities, who basically were blind to these. I mean, they did make some studies, but you know, they weren't writing, they weren't interested, they weren't actually, you know, looking at that at the time. So those biases are actually in the source, the primary sources. And yeah, so it's good that people are going back and, you know, digging out other evidence.
Yeah, indeed. It's an excellent piece.
Yeah.
So thank you, Mark. This has been really enlightening.
Thank you.
I hadn't heard of the parrot pandemic before, and now I feel enlightened. To plug, next week we've got Sasha Gorbelenia coming back. Sasha, otherwise known as Alexander Gorbelenia, sequenced the first coronavirus genome over 30 years ago and gave the current pandemic gut bug its official name, SARS-CoV-2. So you'd be welcome to come back, Mark, to next week and any future one.
Oh, that is interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, Sasha's great. So next week we're discussing a piece called an essay called "Can We Live at Peace with Viruses?" and a couple other things that Sasha's written are going to be on the deck. So thanks again. It's a delightful book, and congratulations on a very visionary account of this pandemic century.
Thank you very much. Thanks for all your fascinating questions. It was great to talk to you.
Thank
you, Mark.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Take
Thanks,
care.
Eben.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.